welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first morning session, which is always the hardest to fill, but thank you all for coming in early. My name is Michael Brenner, Director of the Center for Israel Studies, and I'm honored to open this morning. I'm also happy to welcome the Associate Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Sol Newman. The SPA, the school, is a co-sponsor of this conference. And Davida Itzhaki, who is our program manager, who of course is responsible that everything works so smoothly, as is my dear colleague, Lauren Strauss, who really planned this conference. I'm happy to see Alan Meltzer of the Meltzer-Schwarzberg Center, and who made this conference also possible. Lillian Abenson, Abenson Chair, and also other of our council members. So the topic this morning is history and politics, and since we started with a journalist and a novelist today, I guess we have a purely scholarly panel, which I think will be not less exciting, though. We want to set the stage for the rest of the conference by embedding today's relationship between American Jews and Israel in its historical frame. And I think we could not have found better experts than our morning panel than these four historians who help us to understand the historical context. You can find more elaborate biographies in your booklets, which I hope you all picked up. I will only very briefly introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Next to me, Oz Frankel is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York, and his most recent book is Coca-Cola, Black Panthers, and Phantom Jets, Israel in the American Orbit, 1967 to 73. Next to him, Sharon Masher is a professor of history at Stockton University. Her most recent book is Promised Lands, Hadassah Kaplan and the Legacy of American Jewish Women in Early 20th Century Palestine. And unfortunately, only on the screen, after, I hope, a not too serious injury, okay. Better now? Okay. But he wasn't able to join us after an injury. And thank you, Derek, for at least being able to join us over Zoom. Derek Penzler is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University. And his most recent book is entitled Zionism and Emotional State. And last but not least, we are joined by Jonathan Sarna, who is the Joseph H. and Belly R. Brown Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, and also Chief Historian of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And he's best known for the acclaimed American Judaism, A History, recently published in a second edition. So, without much further ado, I just wanted, what we'll do, we'll have about 3 rounds of questions, and then we'll open it up for short Q&A. So think of your questions as well. Let me start with the question, and maybe address it to Jonathan first. What are one or two of the most important turning points in the history of relationship between American Jews and Israel, and maybe say a few sentences why you think so?
Sure. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here and how impressive the work of this center has been, and last night's session as well. I would say that the first major turning point and it's a shame more attention hasn't been paid to it, is 1881. 1881, if I may be totally anachronistic, was an October 7th moment, meaning here Russian Jews thought things were getting better in Russia. Alexander II was liberalized, and suddenly it all fell apart. Their assumptions were shattered, and many began to think, well, maybe we need to go somewhere else. And really, the two great alternatives to Russian Jewry, then by far the largest Jewish community in the world, were born at that time. One, you had America, promised land, and as we know, a huge number of Jews. There were 250,000 Jews in America in 1880. By the time mass immigration is largely halted, there are going to be 3.5 million Jews after World War I in America. So that's one possibility. And the other possibility is the land of Israel. First Chovevei Tzion, more East European, the lovers of Zion, and then Herzlian Zionism. And actually, those were in competition with one another. Promised land or golden land. A certain number of Jews went from one to the other, usually from the difficult promised land to America. And we know that about over 80% of the Jews who emigrated did come to the United States, and the American Jewish community tried very hard to welcome them, to keep the doors open. They spread across the country, but as might have been predicted, and again, so parallel to our day, nativism is growing. A sense that America is changing, and of course it was changing, not just because of Jewish immigrants, but also Catholics from Italy and Ireland earlier, but Ireland and Italy. And eventually, those forces trying to set the clock back in time are going to pass the Immigration Restriction Bill, the last in 1924, and that's going not totally to cut off immigration, but drastically to cut off the American option. And the very first year that more East European Jews go to the land of Israel than to America is the second turning point, and that's 1924. Now, I should say World War I is enormously important because people who weren't persuaded to leave in the period 1881 and then especially the 20th century early pogroms, the best known Kishinev, but all through that period of pogroms, and then the Russo-Japanese War, which many Jews did not want to fight in, and leads others to go. But World War I, which we forget, was the greatest tragedy that Jews had experienced before the Shoah. The Shoah overshadowed it. We now know that World War I and its aftermath, including the communist takeover, hundreds of thousands of Jews perished in the Civil War and in the horrors of the clashes. So then you had a real problem, and America was closed, and the land of Israel opened, but American Jews, and then I'll let others go, but American Jews, I think, especially after 1924, quite a few of them felt, hey, we had won the lottery. We got into America, and part of the support for Zionism, Louis Brandeis, I have to mention Louis Brandeis once in every presentation, it's in my contract, but Louis Brandeis, who anticipated the immigration restriction and knew that the American option was going to end, his coming to Zionism is immensely important, and he Americanizes it and so on. But nevertheless, 1881 is a turning point, and that period ending in 1924 is a turning point. Let me be extreme. Had America said, "Give me, you're tired, you're poor, they're all welcome in America," like Emma Lazarus wrote, I'm not sure there'd be a state of Israel. I think most of those Jews would happily have come to America, and there wouldn't have been the pressure. But where else were those Jews going to go? And that really is the great importance of those dates.
Thank you. I mean, especially the second one, basically America restricting immigration in 1924, seeing as one of the reasons for immigration and later the establishment of Israel, is really rather unusual and interesting, and I think we should keep that in mind.
And it brings, exactly as you've done, those two histories of American Jewry and Israel have been interwoven for 150 years. But now, since I said one thing, both of the solutions in our time, and that's what's so sad, haven't lived up to the utopian promise.
We'll
And
come to that.
Okay, all right. I get the message. Yeah.
We just have to go through
Yeah.
a lot of speakers. But thank you, Jonathan. That was a great start for our discussion. Let me go to Boston and to Derek.
So I'll move up in time a little bit. You know, although the needs of the Jewish people were great going back to the 1880s, the fact is that Zionism in the United States was not it was not a mass movement during the 1920s and 30s. There were considerably fewer than 100,000 Jews in the United States in 1939 who belonged to Zionist organizations. There were 4 million Jews, and I think German Jews were 5 times more likely to be involved in Zionist groups. These are the much maligned, allegedly highly assimilated German Jews. They were much more likely to be Zionists, even in the 20s. It has nothing to do with Hitler. Most of those Jews who belonged to Zionist organizations in the interwar period were women in Hadassah, which was a very important organization, but it was a non-political one. It was philanthropic, and certainly under the leadership of Henrietta Zold, its founder and founding president, it had what we would consider today a dovish tilt, engaged in projects for the benefit of Jewish and Arab people in Palestine, playgrounds and health clinics and the like. So Zionism really was quite weak in the United States, and even until the war. And then what changes things is the war itself. And it's really not about a love of Israel per se, or the love of the Jewish people who are creating their new national home in Palestine. It's about the Jews in Europe, the Jews who are dying and those who survive. Membership in Zionist organizations increased to between 8 and 10-fold during the war, from around 100,000 to somewhere around 1 million. Some people belong to multiple organizations, but the point is obviously clear that Zionism becomes, as it were, I think by the end of the war, and Jonathan may have mentioned the statistic in one of his books, that I think about the same percentage of Jews belong to Zionist organizations as belong to synagogues. So that's just the kind of the preparation. And then what happens in 47 and 48 is an outpouring of support for the creation of a Jewish state that is simply unprecedented in American Jewish history, from the time of the UN Partition Resolution up through early 1949. The phalanx of volunteers, as well as some paid staff for the United Jewish Appeal and other fundraising agencies, the literally millions of American Jews who provided funds in 1948. And from some of the research I did, I found it wasn't always just what's the 80-20 rule, that 20% of donors give 80% of the donations. But in this case, it was just amazing how individuals were literally mailing dollar bills to fundraising agencies in New York City. School children were contributing. People of very modest means were giving small amounts of money. And yes, there were the major donors as well. The campaigns within each community, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, just an incredible mobilization of emotional energy to help support the creation and the survival of the Jewish state during its war of establishment in 1948. And the result was something both emotional but also quite tangible, which is, in addition to the expressions of again, nationwide, of support for the creation of the state, there's also the fact that Jews raised about $110 million, which was a lot of money back then, and 70 million of it went to buy weapons. And if those weapons had not been purchased on the open market, Israel could not have won its war of establishment. So without American Jewish contributions, Jonathan was talking about things that could very well have led to the state of Israel not being created, like open borders. Also, if world Jewry, but particularly American Jews, had not provided the funding, hard currency, which the Jewish community in Palestine desperately needed, again, Israel probably could not have been established, at least not at that time. One coda, though, is that throughout this emotional outpouring in 1947-48, it's not really about Israel. It's not really about the kibbutzim or the pioneers or all the things that Zionist imagery and propaganda had been disseminating since even the early 20th century. It's really about the Holocaust. It's about compassion and solidarity with victims of the Holocaust. It is about no small level of survivor guilt. And that's very clear. There was a great propaganda film made in 1948 encouraging Jews to give money to Israel, directed by a man who had been, he'd been the editor of Fritz Lang's movies in Weimar, Germany. And then he wound up in Hollywood during the 1930s and 40s, making propaganda films. And it's a film in which the narrator says, it's because of you, the Jews who are not giving enough money, that these Jews who have come to Israel are living in tents. And the narrator says, only cash can make these people, give them a new life. Only cash can ensure they will not go hungry again. So it's a very clear message. Yes, the great turning point is the Holocaust, 1947, 1948. And in a way, although we'll talk now, about the ups and downs between American Jews and Israel ever since, I really think that set the tone for the American Jewish relationship with Israel.
Thank you, Derek. And let's go on right with...
Can I go first?
Oh,
Thank you.
Sharon.
Okay, thank you. So I've just written a book about American Jewish women during the interwar period. So my guess is that when I was brought on the panel, I was going to, the idea would be that I would cover some of the time period that Derek just referred to with Hadassah women and the like. And I see that as really important, and I'll talk more about that later on. But I really want to focus on 1967, which means that us and I are sharing 67, but I'm pretty confident we're going to talk about it from different perspectives. So and I want to take us from where Derek left us off in 1948 to 1967. And between that time period, American Jews feared accusations of dual loyalty, especially given the McCarthy era. During the 1950s and 1960s, Jews and the organized Jewish community was much more focused on fighting for civil rights than Israel. But the Six-Day War in 1967 marked a profound turning point, both for Judaism and for American Jews, institutionally, ideologically, ritually, educationally, and psychologically. For many American Jews, there was first an intense fear and a determination, as Derek alluded to, around 1948. The Holocaust loomed very large, this determination not to see the Holocaust repeated and to do something to prevent it. A 12-year-old Jonathan Sarna remembered watching on TV as Israeli mass as Israelis dug mass graves to prepare for potential slaughter. This, of course, was followed by intense relief and then a rising sense of pride and self-confidence that manifested itself in support for Israel. There was, first of all, as Derek mentioned around 1948, a dramatic upsurge in philanthropy. American Jewish giving was up dramatically from $140 million the previous year to $432 million in 1967. Roughly a quarter of that money was raised within a month of the war. In addition, twice as many people gave to Israel as previously. So it was back to what Derek was talking about, the 80-20 rule. It was many, many people giving significantly. About 8,000 American Jews filled out Jewish agency applications to volunteer. More than half of those volunteers had no formal affiliations with Jewish organizations beforehand. So again, a new group of people feeling this intense sense of connection. There was an increase in travel to Israel and aliyah, migration there. And there were turns within the reform and conservative movement with different sets of Jews building institutions and connections. Jewish camps became infused with Israeli music and dance, something that I write about starting in the interwar period. So there are certainly precursors that begin much earlier to this, but that increased commitment was at an even greater level. After the war, synagogues adopted prayers for the state of Israel and increasingly displayed Israeli flags alongside American ones. This was also the origin of a sharp divide between left and right camps among American Jews. For the left, the war and subsequent occupation was at the heart of ongoing problems of a people with power. The timing here was significant also because of the fragmentation of the New Left, as Black nationalists excluded white members, think of Stokely Carmichael and SNCC, and as they embraced third world liberation movements, demonizing Israel as a colonial power. Jews on the left found themselves ethnically isolated and with challenges to coalition building. Many of them turned instead to experimental Jewish communities. So 1968, so here I'm extending my 1 year, 67, 1 year forward. 1968 marked the inception of the Chavurah movement and also the founding of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Now, for religious Zionists, the military success of the Six-Day War and the acquisition of the West Bank, including the most biblically significant lands, undergirds the growth of settlements. It also marks a turn toward the lawless Messianic Zionism that we see continuing to operate in the West Bank today. So in sum, I would say 1967 marks a huge turning point, both in the short and long term, of the growth of the pro-Israel sentiment on both the right and the left, and that of anti-Zionism.
Thank you, Sharon. So we have 1881, 1924, 1945, 48, 1967. What are
Yes,
you giving
we are
us?
stuck in 1967. We overlap largely. I was about to tell the Jonathan the sauna anecdote. That's always ahead. So 1967. Let me just say something. Following up your presentation, is that in I think 1971, Bella Abzug comes to Israel, and she says, "I'm a leftist, I'm a feminist, I'm a Zionist." So back in 1971, you could still be even a radical leftist, thinking about kibbutzim, about other social movement in Israel, the Histadrut, and so on and so forth, and be a Zionist. I think, and that's a big question, when this disappears. You know, in what time in history it was no longer feasible to say I'm a leftist and a Zionist in the United States. Back to 1967, I will just highlight two other aspects of that particular experience. It's a usual suspect when we think about transition. in the American Jewish attitude towards Israel. One is that I think American Jewry comes to 67 prepared for it on some level, because it actually, by 67, had more self-confidence. So those old quotas and other restrictions were no longer in place. Also, this is not just about Jewish history, it is about American history in general. So we had a president here who was an Irish Catholic, and with that, some understanding of the importance of immigration to American history. It became sort of the kernel of the American experience. The borders opened again for immigration in 1965. And then there's the watershed experience of Fiddler on the Roof in 1964. It's really incredibly important because it became not just a blockbuster in New York, it became sort of kind of a constitutive kind of a performance, not just for Jews. It was immensely popular among non-Jews as well, and then became a global phenomenon. So suddenly it became cool to be a Jew. So Jewishness accrued social and cultural capital. Yiddish became popular. Books about Yiddish expressions. A general was quoted talking about the bagel strategy in Vietnam. There's the famous anecdote about a graffiti on a wall on campus. Marcel Proust was a Yente. So it became cool to be a Jew, and I think if you're looking for a precursor for 1967, it's 1966, and the fight over opening a Coca-Cola branch in Israel. So Coca-Cola refused to do that, refused to open a branch in Israel. And then the ADL in particular, but other Jewish organizations as well, began a campaign to force Coca-Cola to do it, including threats of boycott. And the campaign was successful, just a year before 1967. So that's one point I want to make. The other point I will make is that when we think about American Jewry in Israel, it's not just about public opinion or giving money. The American presence in Israel is palpable between 67 and 73. We have the tourism that you mentioned. So in 1967, 68, there are 90,000 tourists. By 72, 290,000 tourists. And you see in the streets of Tel Aviv, American tourists with the camera dangling off their shoulders, sometimes with a cigar, all kind of Mordecai Richler kind of characters. Hadassah volunteers, exchange students, hippies, American Jewish hippies coming to look for meaning in the Holy Land, kibbutzim volunteers. And also, you see, there is a moment, an interesting moment in the history of Israel when American Jews or people who grew up in this country assume major roles in politics and other aspects of Israeli public life. So we have Liu Katz, a professor of communication who builds the Israel TV corporation. That's in 1968. We have Don Patenkin, is the chief economist in Israel. Shimon Aganat, who is the Chief Justice, was born in this country, educated in Chicago. And then we have a prime minister, Golda Meir, who was born, I believe, in Pinsk, but grew up in Milwaukee. And she's a linchpin. She's really, it's serendipity. She becomes prime minister in 1968 when Levi Eshkol dies. And she has particular kind of affinity with the Jewish American community. She speaks in their language. That's unprecedented. Levi Eshkol was a stutterer. Ben-Gurion was not a real great public speaker, but Golda was. So major figures in the Israeli public life and government come from the United States. Certainly, Israeli academia becomes so populated with scholars who were educated in the United States rather than in Europe, especially in France. And that also affects Israeli politics. I always give the example of on the one hand, Marsha Friedman. Marsha Friedman becomes a member of Knesset in the last day of 1973. She's the first radical feminist to be elected to any legislature in the world. And that's on the left, but on the right there's Rabbi Meir Kahane, who arrives in Israel. Both of them are newcomers to Israel, who arrived to Israel in 1971 with his brand of nationalism and racism. And the two of them, these are just two individuals, but they also represent kind of a range of political views and political approaches that arrive in Israel at the turn of the 1970s. So if you want to talk about the relevance of that, you can see beginning in the turn of the 70s, the bifurcation of Israeli politics that is in some kind of conversation, negotiation with American politics.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think we already heard a few surprising facts here, but I want to go a little deeper into that. If everyone would briefly, and we have to look a little bit about the time management too, briefly mention one fact which you think is either unknown or understudied, which might deserve more attention. What would you choose? Let's start with Sharon.
Thank you. So something that I think is under-researched and deserves more attention is the role that women and gender played in the relationship between American Jews and Israel. And I can start with an ordinary observation, which is that I have children who have gone to Jewish day school, and I've seen their curriculum, and I've seen what they focus on when they study Zionism, and there's barely a woman mentioned in the curriculum, and almost no mention of gender and gendered dynamics. This leads me to the more academic piece of this, which is looking at Susanna Heschel and Sarah Imhoff's recently published book, The Woman Question in Jewish Studies, which talks about anthologies, conferences, editorial boards, and the absences of women's voices on them. In thinking about this, I pulled off my shelf Gil Troy's The Zionist Ideas and did a rough count, and there were about 20 of the 170 entries there included women's voices. These absences are particularly concerning because of the isolation of those writing anything related to Israel from the fields of women's studies, ethnic studies, and American studies. And I speak of this personally as someone who has become on the outs in various fields that used to be my home. Work, however, has been done on American women and Palestine, Israel. So here I'm thinking of an edited volume by Shulamit Reinhartz and Mark Rader, American Jewish Women and the Zionist Enterprise. There's been writing on Hadassah, the organization, Henrietta Zold. Sarah Imhoff recently wrote an excellent book on the Zionist educator, Jesse Samter. My own work fits into that field. I have recently published a book focusing on the experiences of my grandmother, Hadassah Kaplan, later Musher, who was the second daughter of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. She traveled to Mandatory Palestine in 1932 as a teacher who had lost her job in the midst of the Great Depression. And the book argues that for a relatively small but influential group of adventurous American Jewish women, travel to Palestine offered a chance for personal growth and communal engagement while still remaining good mothers, wives, and daughters. My work fits into a broader literature that shows that American Jewish women played a role beyond their numbers in shaping Palestine. Think here of Henrietta Zold, Golda Meir, Jessie Samter, Julia Dushkin, Deborah Kalin, Irma Lindheim, and Marie Serkin. And maybe some of those names are unfamiliar to you, and maybe that'll prompt you to try and learn more about them. Such women often attempted to graft American progressive ideas onto Palestine, particularly in terms of social welfare and education. American Jewish women, like my grandmother, also played an important role in shaping American Zionism. Most of those traveling women, those tourists, as you mentioned, would eventually return to the United States. And when they did, they brought their love of travel and Hebrew into Hebrew schools, Talmud Torahs. They turned to writing educational manuals, creating children's books, and teaching Jewish folk music and dance. American Jewish women also played critical roles in philanthropy. The organization Hadassah, which we've already mentioned, was dedicated to promoting universal health care in Palestine and later Israel. And that Hadassah moved Zionism into the mainstream in the interwar period when it became the largest single American Zionist organization. In addition to knowing more about American Jewish women and their relationship to Israel, scholars should pay more attention to men, masculinity, sexuality, and intersectionality in thinking about the relationship between American Jews and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, the often mentioned Golda Meir, we should remember she was the first woman as a prime minister or in a leading position at the top of the state of any Western state. We're still waiting for this in this country, right? But that was in 1969. That's a long time ago. It's a little different now with the women representation in Knesset, but we'll talk about this maybe in the discussion. Derek, let's go to you next.
All right, thanks. I think we need to study more. There's been some pioneering work done, but we need a lot more on how American Jews, going back to Israel's creation, knew about and thought about Israel's relations with Arabs within the country, what they felt about the Palestinian refugee issue, what they felt about the early years of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. This actually goes back to the war of 1948 itself, when, to my surprise, the whole question of the Palestinian refugees was widely reported in American Jewish newspapers nationwide. And they didn't hold back. They talked about what was happening. They talked about expulsions. They talked about flight. And at least early in the war, the American Jewish press was full of articles about how the Arab refugees would be welcomed back, and that their lands were being tended by IDF soldiers who would return the lands to them with interest. And then later in 1948, the tone changed, as it did in Israel, that these refugees would not be allowed back, and a new discourse began to appear that the Arabs had fled of their own will or under the command of their Arab leaders. That way of talking simply hadn't existed earlier in the war. It comes in the summer of 1948. And then on a more elite level, after Israel was created, there are American Jewish organizations that they're concerned about the treatment of Arabs in Israel. Arabs who were citizens of Israel during the 50s lived under martial law. And this was something that American Jewish organizations were aware of, particularly the American Jewish Committee, as Jeffrey Levin has pointed out in a really interesting new book. The American Jewish Committee they were officially non-Zionist. They certainly were not anti-Zionist, absolutely not. But they were concerned about essentially what it could look like for the state of Israel to be treating its own Arab citizens poorly, to be so recalcitrant on the issue of reaccepting Palestinian refugees. And this was coming from the American Jewish Committee, not from an anti-Zionist organization on the far left. There was a lot of concern in the American Jewish Committee about the Kfar Qasim massacre in October of 1956, when almost 50 Arab civilians were murdered by the IDF simply for violating a curfew. So this was part of mainstream American Jewish politics, that there was awareness of these issues and concern. And it continues on. Philip Klutznick, president of the B'nai B'rith, president of the World Jewish Congress, very stalwart leader of American Jewry, went to several Middle Eastern countries in 1981, maintaining contact with Arab leaders. And then just last, there were upstart organizations like Brera from the early 1970s. This was a group of young people, university students, many of them, Jewishly very literate, They knew Hebrew. They had spent a lot of time in Israel. These people were very connected to Israel, and they were demanding something that seemed unheard of at the time, which was a two-state solution, which back then seemed quite, unacceptable, and then it became more accepted in the 90s. And the fate of Brera, we actually know something about. They were essentially driven out of the American Jewish establishment, or they weren't allowed into the American Jewish establishment. But what I'm getting at, just to sum up in one sentence, is that the concerns that many American Jews have today about Israel's treatment of Palestinians, most recently in the destruction of Gaza, this is something that has a long tail, or a deep origin in the early history of the state. It's not that American Jews have been ignorant of or not interested in thinking about Israel, the Palestinian refugees, and Palestinians living under Israeli control.
Thank you, Derek. And Oz, you want to continue?
Sure, I'll be short. I promise. I'll begin with the Bella Abzug moment in 1971. And I wonder what happened in the next 30 years in the following sense. That Israeli politics veers rightward. In 1977, there's a new prime minister, Menachem Begin, and the Likud party becomes the hegemonic party in Israeli politics ever since. American politics also veers rightward, the neoconservatism, Ronald Reagan, and so on and so forth. We all know that story. And it seems to me that the Jewish establishment, or the leadership of American Jewish Zionist organizations, also turns more conservative. But that's not true of the rest of the American Jewish population that continues to uphold rather liberal point of view about American politics and elsewhere. And so I wonder, when was it no longer feasible to be progressive and Zionist, but also how this tension grew over time until it couldn't hold anymore. So it seems to me that many liberal American Jews continued by the 80s, 90s of the last century to uphold an idealized and romanticized view of Israel that at a certain point became untenable. I think there was a case of cognitive dissonance between all kinds of expectations and the reality on the ground. We see that over the last 2 years, but I think there were a great sign of that in the previous 20 and 30 years. So I would be curious to know more about this process.
Great, thank you. And Jonathan, what do you have for us?
The theme that I want to highlight is actually technology. That's a theme that Jewish history doesn't think enough about. Everything is ideas. But we began talking about tourism. Tourism from America to the land of Israel essentially begins in 1867 when I'm sorry? No, 1867. I know what. 1867 is the year of, many of you will know the book, The Innocents Abroad. That's Mark Twain's breakout volume. He has gone on a ship called the Quaker City. The Quaker City was an early ocean-going steamship. It had been souped up during the Civil War, and suddenly there was a vessel that could, as that vessel did, take you from New York all the way through to the Holy Land with many intermediate stops and return you, and you knew when you were leaving and when you were coming back. And Mark Twain's book, one of the great bestsellers of its time, really made the Holy Land seem like someplace exciting. And once there was an easy way of going, it used to take you 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks to get to the land of Israel, and it took 7 changes of ships and so on. Once all of that disappeared, we begin to see a very dramatic rise in the second half of the 19th century in tourism, of course, America generally. There only were about 4,000 Americans who went abroad in 1850, and by 1900, that's multiplied many times over. But the Holy Land becomes especially important, and a whole industry is created, the tourism industry, not just for Jews, but for Christians. Ulysses S. Grant comes, and people think about, oh, I'll make my tour of the Holy Land. In a sense, the 20th century developments about which you've written about all come from that. So that's technology one. Technology two, of course, is what the jet makes possible, what the airplane makes possible. 1951 is the inauguration of regular service between New York and Tel Aviv. That changes a lot of things. And as we begin seeing people who go back and forth, that all depends on air travel, and from basically over the next 20, it's like the computer, over the next 25 years, gets better and better. So 1973 is the first non-stop from America. In its day, the longest flight that you could take was between New York and Tel Aviv, and that, of course, changed everything. And American Jews can begin to learn about Israel in new ways. Summer programs, which are so influential, become possible, because once you can fly to Israel, then you can go, spend the summer, get back. Before then, you had to take a boat, and that added 8-9 days on either end. So technology, and of course in our day, digital technology, has totally transformed the America-Israel relationship, and unfortunately we don't pay enough attention, I think, to the technological background that indeed allowed American Jews to discover Israel in new ways, allowed Israelis to discover America in new ways, and brought these two centers together in ways that would have been completely unthinkable before 1867.
Thank you. Really a surprising perspective that many of us don't think of when we think of the relations. And sorry for my early interruptions. I expected to go on 1967.
I have a
Let's-
book coming out on Mark
On Mark
and
Twain,
Jews.
right.
Well,
Yeah.
1867 is a big day for me, yeah.
So let's start our last round before we turn to you all. And I would like to ask a little bit about, a topic that is so much being discussed now. These are tensions or differences, maybe not necessarily tensions, but differences between American Jews and Israelis, people maybe even before 1948 in the land of Israel, in Palestine. If we go to history, what comes to your mind, which kind of facts? And I think we go in the reversed order and start with Jonathan.
So much has already been said, and I won't repeat it. American Jews are more liberal and so on. Not going to go there. But we should say a word, again, Brandeis. The Brandeis-Weizmann dispute and the break between Louis Brandeis and Chaim Weizmann in the 1920s is very important, because it didn't just reflect a personal break. It was two different views. And Louis Brandeis was deeply concerned about the stewardship of money every penny should be well accounted for. He was deeply worried about how European Zionists, instead of having a stewardship view of money, they had an instrumental view of money. An instrumental view of money means, who cares about what goes on in the middle? What's important is our ends, what we want to get. And a stewardship says, no, I need to know everything about that money and watch it very carefully. If someone with a stewardship view marries someone with an instrumental view, they're likely to have money tensions their whole life. I'm going to slightly disagree with my friend Derek here. I don't think it's linear at all, Zionism in America. Zionism in America goes up dramatically in World War I and Louis Brandeis, and there's an enormous coalition. And then the breakdown of that relationship, and it was covered in all the papers and very widely seen, divided Zionism, led to the decline. To put it mildly, Louis Lipsky was no Louis Brandeis. And you never heard of Lipsky, but he kind of ran the Zionist movement during the interwar years. No wonder it went down. But that break, and in a way, the American tradition of doing things and the Zionist tradition, that clash has never ended. Those of you who have followed in our day the World Zionist Congress disputes, that's essentially about, are we going to have a Brandeis approach to money, how it's spent, or are we going to say, look, we need yeshivas, don't ask too many questions, just look at the institutions that we get money to. If you like, it's a Yekish view of money versus a Hasidic view of money. And indeed, if you go back to the original Weizmann v. Brandeis, they called it Washington versus Pinsk. And that was right. It was two different worldviews. And that clash of worldviews has never ended. As you can imagine, I could go on and on, but I will turn it back
Thank
to
you,
Michael.
but I think we'll may stay with Washington Pinsk a little bit. Oz, what's your...
Yes, my grandmother comes from Pinsk.
Mine comes from Minsk.
Between Pinsk and Minsk. So Jews like to disagree. So there's another moment like that at the beginning of the 50s, and the topic is the meaning of Zionism. Right, so on one side, David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, on the other side, individuals like Jacob Blaustein and others, American Jews, American Zionists. And Ben-Gurion is very adamant about the idea that if you are a Zionist, you need to move to Israel, make Aliyah, because otherwise there's no, meaning to the term Zionist. The American view was that this is not an imperative. You can support Israel from abroad. You don't need to move to Israel. And then there's the famous joke about Zionism being one person gives money to a second person to have a third person go to Israel. And that actually, this particular debate was not resolved during David Ben-Gurion's tenure as a prime minister. He, by the mid-50s, stopped using the term Zionism anymore. He was profoundly disappointed by this. But Israel, I think, came to live with this reluctance to move to Israel. So by 1970, Yitzhak Rabin, who was an ambassador, Israeli ambassador to Washington at the time, says something that I think was born with Brandeis, that Zionism makes American Jews better Americans. So he accepted this approach, that you can be a great Zionist while being, a loyal American. I think many American Jews accepted that. I just want to say something else about Jonathan's remark. I think with all the technology in the world, with all the technology that we have now, TV and of course, and social media, there's a lot by misrecognition across the Atlantic. So I don't think Israelis know American Jewry terribly well, and I don't think American Jews understand Israel terribly well. I mean, and maybe that's actually productive misrecognition because it allows those kind of alliances despite all of those other issues and disputes. And there was great ambivalence at the turn of the 70s, the period that I worked on, in the sense that on the one hand, Israel became more dependent on American Jews, but also resisted and resented this dependence. I mean, the word schnorr became popular back then. That's a pejorative term. And also American Jewry, there was a lot of press coverage in Israel on the rift between African Americans and American Jews, with maybe the wishful thinking that one day those millions of Jews will immigrate to Israel. And also there are all kind of unsavory American Jews who arrived in Israel at the time, most famously Meir Lansky, the gangster. And suddenly Israelis became cognizant of the great American Jewry contribution to the annals of American crime. And it had to actually a bleak turn of the 70s view of the United States as a fragmented, fractured society that is about to collapse. So those kind of ambiguities have been part of this alliance as well.
Thank you. I think we have to remember again today and remind people what Brandeis said. To be a Zionist, you might be a better American, not worse, right?
To be better American, we need to be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must be Zionists.
Right. Derek? You're muted.
Oh, I think I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Go. So one theme in this round of questions has been about the freedom of American Jews to continue operating in some ways as an independent community. Even though Israel exists and most American Jews support Israel, what kind of freedom of action, of political action, what meaning do their lives have as Jews because they don't live in Israel and the overwhelming majority choose not to live in Israel? And a good example of that tension between American Jewry and Israel, despite the very strong connections between them, was the Soviet Jewry campaign, which goes back to the 1960s, the early to mid 60s, and ran through the 1980s, in that what the Israeli government wanted and what the American Jewish organizations that were behind the, say, Soviet Jewry campaign wanted were really overlapping but quite different, which is that the American Jews who were so involved in the Save Soviet Jewry movement, they wanted freedom and liberty for Jews in the Soviet Union, but then the Israelis wanted them to come to Israel. And, well, what did the Soviet Jews want? And it sort of goes back to Jonathan's comments about 1924, when many Jews in Eastern Europe who would have been happy to come to North America couldn't. So they wound up having to go to what at that time was Palestine. So in the 1970s, there's a phenomenon of what's called dropouts. That is, Jews from the Soviet Union who do, thanks to American pressure, they've gotten exit visas for Israel. And they fly to one of the designated stations, as it were, sort of transit stations. They fly to Vienna or to Rome, and the idea is that there they will go on to Israel, which is certainly what the Israeli government wants. But the American organizations support freedom of choice, and many of those Soviet Jews actually would much rather go to America, and they do, and they wind up making places like Brighton Beach or something into Soviet Jewish enclaves. And there's a lot of tension there between the state of Israel and American Jewry, and it raises a question that exists to this day, which is what level of autonomy are American Jews considered authorized to exercise in their philanthropic or political activity on behalf of Jews anywhere in the world? Does everything have to go through Israel? Does Israel somehow have to dominate the political decisions of world Jewry, even though today we have a minister of diaspora affairs in the state of Israel who has openly allied with anti-Semites? And there was a notorious conference several months ago in which he invited, this is Chikli, who invited members of these highly extreme right-wing political parties in Europe to come to Israel to decry anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiment, which of course makes sense, that he would be concerned about that. But what if these people are also anti-Semites? To what extent can American Jews and should American Jews operate independently of the government of the state of Israel on issues that they believe affect the security, the well-being of Jews worldwide? That tension still exists.
Thank you, Derek. And our last contribution in this round is Sharon.
Great. So my focus for the tensions between U.S. Jews and Israelis is on American Jewish opposition to control by the Orthodox rabbinate. When my grandmother Hadassah arrived in Jerusalem in 1932, it was the day before Yom Kippur. She had a tooth pulled, she had an injury, and then went to the Kotel. She proceeded to write home about the services she encountered there and throughout the Jewish high holidays. She commented on how lacking in spirituality she found them. She was particularly unhappy about being relegated to a women's section where she found few women. She also wrote about her disappointment at not being allowed to touch the Torah, much less dance with it on Simchat Torah. Now, her story, of course, was pretty unusual. She was the second daughter of Mordechai Kaplan, and her older sister, Judith Kaplan, later Eisenstein, became the first bat mitzvah. Still, it highlights a tension between American Jews, who tend to embrace religious pluralism, and ones in Israel, where most are either secular or Orthodox, although, of course, there are others, and that's part of a larger discussion. Hadassah's father, Mordechai Kaplan, was an early Zionist at a time when few embraced the movement, as Derek has said. He imagined a Jewish homeland as an essential source of cultural, ethical, and religious values that would facilitate the evolution of what he called Jewish civilization. Mordechai promoted a Zionism grounded in democracy, religious pluralism, minority rights, and a separation of church, or in this case, synagogue, and state. Rather than calling for Jewish migration, as Ben-Gurion did, or reinforcing orthodoxy, Kaplan hoped a Jewish homeland would forge a new and creative Judaism worldwide. He insisted that a Jewish homeland would have the potential to create ethical beings and inspire self-realization, not only where it was located, but also throughout the diaspora. According to his biographer, Mel Scult, Mordechai was so devoted to Zionism that he nearly called his approach Zionist Judaism rather than Reconstructionism. Now, of course, in many ways, Mordechai's vision of Zionism was not enacted. This can particularly be seen in terms of the atheist Ben-Gurion's decision shortly after the founding of the state to empower the Orthodox rabbinate to control marriage, divorce, conversion, military service, and kashrut. The Orthodox monopoly over Jewish ritual and definition of who is a Jew is particularly problematic for American Jews because most of them don't identify as Orthodox. During the 1950s and 1960s, the conservative movement was the largest denomination in American Jewry. Today, Reform is that largest. Most American Jews are religious pluralists, whereas many American Jews have bristled at the term occupation or turned away from discussing settlers' treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank. They have not been reluctant to protest Orthodox control over marriage, divorce, and conversion, and to advocate for women's religious and civil rights through groups like Women at the Wall and the International Coalition for Agunah Rights. When my daughters go to the Kotel today, more than 100 years after their great-grandmother became a bat mitzvah, they can only read from the Torah in Robinson's Arch or wear a tallis there. Robinson's Arch is a specially designated space for egalitarian prayer that still lacks basic infrastructure and support. Ongoing tensions between American Jews and Israelis over Orthodox control lends credence to a very American concept that Mordechai Kaplan promoted in the early 20th century, a separation of church and state. It supports empowering civil courts rather than the Orthodox rabbinate to make such decisions.
Thank you, Sharon, for reminding us of this really important fact. And if I go back to our discussion in the last hour or so, it was a real, as a historian, it's a firework of different historical stories, or as my grandmother from Minsk would say, a real mechaya, to hear all of those different accounts, which many of us don't always think about, from the 1867 travel of Mark Twain, to Coca-Cola, and also the early disagreements coming from Derek around also 1948 already about Palestinians in Israel, and of course the stories about women. It's your turn now, and we're up for Q&A. And Davida, you have the mic, and Lauren, you have another mic, so please raise
As
your
always,
hands.
we're going to prioritize student
Yeah, I'm
questions.
looking this part, so think of your questions, and who wants to
Looking
go
at you, my
first?
class.
But everybody is, of course, encouraged. Okay, we have a student here. We're all students.
What a wonderful program this is, and thank you, Lauren and others, for putting this together, Howard Marks. Jonathan mentioned the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. So my grandfather, blessed memory, was in the Tsarist army. And my question to the panel, in terms of the sort of the disparity between American Jews and Israeli Jews, Israel is not a martial state. But everyone serves in Israel. Women, as I understand, for 2 years in the IDF, and men 3 years. They're there for instant call-up. Here in America, I served in the Army, but we don't have a draft anymore. Young people especially, look at the Army and service and the military in a disparaging way. How much does this lead to this sort of, like Israel mentality is more like, we could be attacked anytime and we have to be prepared. 900 Israeli soldiers died in this current conflict, 900. That's equivalent to 30,000 Americans. And yet there's not even any discussion here. So how much is this sort of lead to this sort of tension between American Jews and Israeli Jews? Thank you.
Derek, you wrote a whole book about soldiers in army. Is that something you want to take on? But I'm also looking at the panel here. Jonathan?
I'm happy to. Look, you're certainly correct. Indeed, when you send young American Jews to Israel, they interact with Israelis, but then they diverge because the Israelis are going to have this military service, and the Americans are going back, say, to university after their gap year. And those experiences distinguish them. I have to say, I think that the events of October 7th and we were talking about this in the very long reserve duty that Israelis have served, and the experience, it's going to make a wider gap between the two. We have various people, Professor Rosner is here and so on, who can talk about that from Israel. But I think, the observation is a good one, And it's more recent. I don't even go back to the Russo-Japanese War. My great-grandfather served in the Russo-Japanese War, had stories about it. He said, look, that's why the Russians lost. They tried to bring people like me into the military. But in those days, because of World War I and World War II, and the large number of American Jews who served, that wasn't an issue. But more recently, of course it was. And I think it's important. And like so much else, you could also go back to 1967, where American young people were recoiling from Vietnam and rather looking down, even on their fellow Jews who served in Vietnam. And then you had the heroes of Tzahal and so on, and the joke that maybe Israel would handle Vietnam, and Moshe Dayan actually traveled to Vietnam, highlighting that divide.
And Menachem Begin took in the first boat refugees from Vietnam, also forgotten. Anyone else?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Jacob DeMarco. I'm in Professor Strauss's class, and I was able to go to Israel before October 7th through my school, and I'm wondering now, after October 7th, how younger people like me, we can be influenced more to go back to Israel after October 7th, and maybe through how younger people today might be more fearful to go back, or to not want to go back, but to go back, or to go for the first time with everything that's occurred recently. Thank you.
So since I'm not shy, unless others want, Jacob, you mentioned.
Yeah, I can.
Oh, well, but you make such a marvelous point. I want to extend it. It is not generally realized that because of COVID, followed by October 7th, a whole essentially generation of American Jews has not made it to Israel. And you can feel that at the university, the gap between those who have firsthand knowledge of Israel and those who do not. But whereas prior to COVID, huge numbers of students of all kinds had gone to Israel on one program or another, and it was something that they shared, even if their tours were different. Since COVID, it's not. What we can do about it, I very much hope that there will be a campaign to help Americans of all kinds, but certainly American Jews, go to Israel. Birthright was enormously successful, I think, and it would be a great pity if it was allowed to disintegrate. But it's wonderful that you highlight for us that point, because it's not well understood, and it has something to do with what happened at the university as well.
Just to add a comment here, of course, we felt it too, because our students used always to go to Israel. At some point, COVID first, and then October 7th, that stopped. At the same time, and we mentioned it last night briefly, and I see my colleague Saul Newman here, we will have the first class jointly taught between American University and the Hebrew University this coming spring, bringing students from here to Jerusalem for a week, and from Jerusalem to Washington for a week, which is a big step, besides all the other programs, Hillel, and so on and so on. For those who want to sign up, it's already filled, right? But we will find more classes and occasions in the future. Derek?
Oh, I just wanted to mention that even at hyper-cautious Harvard, the lawyers have recently downgraded the security threat or whatever that Israel allegedly would present. And so students are allowed to go back there now. And so that's one issue. Harvard sends actually non-Jewish students to Israel as well through something called Israel Trek, and it's been quite successful. But there's the other issue that Israel is, to put it mildly, not popular on many American campuses. This is something that affects non-Jewish students and Jewish students alike. Um, it's a hugely controversial issue, but there's no doubt that the emotional attachments that American Jews have to Israel are very much dependent on age, and that those under the age of 35, and particularly under the age of 25, definitely feel much less attached to the country than those who are older. And this is something that's very difficult for people who are like 50 and over to really grapple with, is younger American Jews, by no means all of them, but a significant number, simply do not have those connections with Israel. Now, is there a correlation between going to Israel and forming a strong attachment to the country? Probably. Although there are plenty of people, and I run across as a university teacher, who have spent time in Israel who nonetheless have, very strongly critical feelings about it. So there's a couple of things going on here. There's the physical distance that Jonathan correctly pointed out, but we're also living in an era of a political sea change in how younger American Jews, like Americans across the board, younger Americans across the board, view Israel.
And I would just say, even the more important it is that we have to have programs like this and bring students over, because most of the students who go to Israel, whatever their views, they have a first-hand view. And we also actually have a group of non-Jewish students going this December from AU and many other programs. And I think, just want to repeat, we have scholarships, we have opportunities for all students to visit Israel, and many of those opportunities are really taken up, and the classes are full who do this.
Hi, I have a kind of more academic. Hi, my name's Josh Leifer. I have a little bit more of an academic question, which is that we've spoken about essentially the two great political alternatives for Jews in the world being American liberalism and Zionism as it's embodied by Israel. But of course, there was a third great option over the course of the 20th century, which was socialism, which probably numbered numerically over that long arc more Jewish adherents than the two ideologies that have survived into our day. And I wanted to ask the panelists what they think about the disappearance of Jewish socialism or social democracy as a bridging language between Jews and Israel and the United States. For instance, we talked about Golda Meir, but Golda Meir was also the deputy chairman of the Second Socialist International. By 1977, when Begin takes power, there's basically no more public Jewish socialism as a lived politics in the world, arguably. And so I'm curious how the scholars on this panel think about the collapse of that language as an available Jewish language for active politics.
Thank you. Great question. Ross?
It's a great question, of course, and I think what we need to consider what happened to socialism, especially in the 60s. So the old type socialism that was very close to trade unionism was very conducive to Zionism, obviously, and Golda Meir epitomizes this kind of link. But socialism after the 70s is no longer that way, and the left turns towards a post-colonial period, and Israel is a target of hostility because of that. We have now the resurgence of socialism in the United States. It does not connect very well with Zionism. And also one of the most disturbing phenomenon is the way that UAW and other trade unions are actually moving into a hostile position towards Israel for the first time. And that was not the case, obviously, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Actually, trade unions, the AAFL-CIO, was cardinal to cementing the alliance between the United States and Israel, including non-Jews. But that, again, those alliances are no longer feasible. I want to say something about army service as well, military service as well. I think I think one of the attractions, first of all, in Israel, military service defines masculinity. And I think one of the attractions in the 60s and 70s is kind of surrogate masculinity. So American Jews really reveling in this kind of alpha male Israeli American man, that is. I'm sorry. Maybe, I'm not sure just man. I mean, there's something very attractive about the superhero Israeli, well, for some. Yes, for some. I understand that. I understand that. I mean, in the TV series Mad Men, you know, in one episode, there's a minor character that has a huge poster of Moshe Dayan. He's not a Jew, but there's something about Moshe Dayan's sort of militarism, charisma, and so on and so forth that is attractive, not just for Jews, obviously. But this kind of surrogacy in masculinity is no longer very, very attractive, and I think that has been the case much before October 7th.
I want to add to Josh Leifer's very important question, but I want to turn it the opposite way around. We've actually forgotten the communist period, where young people, and believing they were the future, insisted it's not Israel, it's Moscow. And in the 1930s, some of our smartest young Jews were ardent supporters of communism. I used to show it to students, a slide of them marching down Fifth Avenue with big posters of Stalin and Lenin. Now, of course, that ended in disaster. A certain number went back to Russia in the 1930s. As you can imagine, it didn't end well. The entire Bund was liquidated, and one of the great failures. Now, there were three options, in other words, that left-wing Jews had. They could, leave their Jewish associates behind. We don't go to synagogue. We don't believe in this Jewish ethnicity much stuff. We're going with Russia. And some of them did that. The second, especially when it failed, was to keep quiet, which many of them did. Brooklyn is full of people who know that their parents or grandparents were card-carrying communists, but boy, they don't put it on Facebook. And then the third group did tshuva. They became neocons and
The
so on.
Trotskyites
How
became
we
neocons.
were right, how mistaken we were. I remember hearing Milton Himmelfarb in his day talk about that. My view, same thing will happen today. The same young people who Derek rightly talks about will be embarrassed at some of what they've said. Yeah, we'll lose some of them. And some of them will be quiet when they realize we associated with them. And some of them, in 25 years, will be neocons. And here, I guess I'm disagreeing with Mr. Leifer's book. I'm not saying that history always repeats itself, but yeah, it rhymes. And this rhyming, but I tell the story so that we don't imagine, as some say, that it's all linear, it's kind of in the books, that the next generation won't be pro-Israel. First of all, they're very noisy, but they're between 20, 30%, not the majority. And second of all, and this refers in a way to everything about American Jews in Israel. American Jewry, as Derek rightly pointed out, is being utterly transformed. The big growth area is not Washington, D.C. or Boston. It's Florida. It will soon be the second largest Jewish community in the world. The fastest growing groups are not Reform, whom you mentioned, whom actually are way down, and certainly not conservative. Fastest growing Orthodox Chabad, as well as none of the above. But the growth of Orthodoxy is unbelievably important because everybody else forgot how to have children. And those guys have a lot of children, and they marry young. They get in 3 generations at the time that everyone else gets in 4. So when we have a follow-up conference in 100 years, the whole portrait of American Jewry will be very, very different. And I don't think many people appreciate all the changes that are going on. We're still talking about American Jewry as it was, rather than American Jewry as it is becoming.
And I think that's one thing where we see clear parallels between Israel with the Orthodox population growing. And one other thing, I don't think any of the people who were Fifth Avenue communists made Aliyah to Birobijan, which was another option, right?
That didn't end well either.
Can we just have a last round, because we are coming close to the end? Quick questions, and then we'll collect a few, and then we go, and yes, please.
Larry Sidman, thank you very much for this extraordinary panel. So one of the things that you've highlighted is a series of inflection points. And I think it's probably reasonable to say that we are now at the next inflection point, and one characteristic of that is increased vulnerability, both of the Israeli Jewish population, notwithstanding the kind of quasi-results of this recent war, where Israel still and Israeli Jews still feel they are fighting a seven-front war every day, and the increased vulnerability of the American Jewish population, given the surge in anti-Semitism from both the radical left, a jihadist-inspired left, and the extreme right. And the question is, do you feel this increased vulnerability of both Israeli and American Jews can promote greater understanding, empathy, and ultimately a greater sense of unity between the two communities?
Thank you. Remember the question. There is another one coming.
Hi, my name is Sarah Nitzen. My question is, you spoke a bit about the tension between like the Israeli government and American Jewry in the past. Can you speak a bit about what that looks like now post October 7th?
Okay, I think we'll run out of time, so everybody has maybe a short answer to one or both questions.
Okay, so you spoke about increased vulnerability among American Jews and also Israelis, and whether that would lead to a greater connection or less of one. And I'm really not sure. I think with American Jews, I'm seeing people going to either end. There's so little space in the, as Jonathan was just saying, in the progressive world for American Zionists. And I think that's something that people, I'll just say for myself, that people are looking for and unsure if they will find. So I see either people moving away from Judaism or moving towards Orthodoxy. And I see a lot of people getting lost in between. There are many people who are not eager to move to Texas or to Florida, politically or Jewishly. And I think there are real questions about where they'll go. And in terms of increased vulnerability in Israel, yes, that is very true, but I also think it's important to talk about Israeli power, which is also a big piece of the story. I think I'm going to leave the second question.
Yeah, I think Israel is much stronger than it pretends to be. And I think it was in quite a good shape before October 7th. Then there was this faux pas that caused this calamity, but yeah. Why do we go back to history? I think we are looking for continuity and sometimes for solace. But I think that there's so much that history can teach us. History sometimes rhymes, but sometimes history misses the point. And so we are in a new world. It's hard to predict what the future is going to bring. I don't share this kind of optimism that Jonathan articulated. My bottom line, I don't see stronger ties between Israel and American Jewry. I mean, we talk about American Jewish community, but it's not really a single community. It's incredibly diverse. And I think that it will become more diverse, and maybe we'll see a rift within this community when it comes. I mean, I'm concerned about college-age Jews who no longer feel that being a Jew is cool. To come back to my initial remarks, and the ways to assimilate in this country are incredibly easy. And there will be some incentive to lose sight of, your Jewish past or Jewish identity, and that would affect a large swath of the Jewish community, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Derek?
On these issues, I think I'm something of an optimist, to quote Emil Habibi's Kara novel, and I'm both optimistic. I think pessimistic in the short run, but optimistic in the long run. First off, I think October 7th, regardless of the actual extent of the calamity, 1,200 people in a country of millions, it is awful. But it did not threaten the very existence of the state of Israel, and yet the way it's been perceived, right? It's been perceived in Israel as a cataclysm, not just in terms of loss of life, but in terms of the inability of the state to protect its citizens. So regardless of the actual physical extent of the catastrophe, it's the way it's been perceived. And I think that both Israeli Jews and North American Jews, I mentioned North American because I'm a Canadian as well as American citizen, so I have to just reference that big country to the north. There is a feeling of vulnerability that the two peoples share, although they might not actually share with each other. I think it's developing in tandem. And as far as the tensions between American Jewry and Israel since October 7th, I agree with Jonathan about the strength of the Orthodox community and that it is growing. However, let's say today it's 12% of American Jewry, maybe soon it'll be 15%. The fact is the overwhelming majority of American Jews are not Orthodox. And if all we have are Orthodox Jews, it would take probably about a century for Orthodox Jews to become, to number in the millions. It's going to take a long time, and a lot can happen between now and then. So if all we count on for American Jewry is the Orthodox, then the future of American Jewry is really quite bleak. And I do agree that a lot of younger American Jews, it's not that they're anti-Zionist, it's not that they're sitting in the encampments, it's not that they're demonstrating on behalf of Palestine. They're confused, they're ambivalent. They might be Zionist adjacent or anti-Zionist curious. This is the overwhelming majority, at least of the students I have taught, fall into those categories. Israel simply doesn't have the meaning for them that it had for their parents and their grandparents. It's not hostility. It's confusion, apathy, indifference, pain. And so I think moving forward, what we have to do is understand that we're not talking about zealous anti-Zionists among younger American Jews. We're talking about people who are confused and uncertain. We live in an era of tremendous uncertainty across the board, and we need to figure out how to address them, taking their concerns and their anxieties seriously.
Thank you. And a brief last word before coffee break.
I'm glad that you raised the question of vulnerability. It's the right question. So Pamela Nadell, who's the American University professor who is not here because she's selling her book that everyone should read on anti-Semitism.
She's in San Diego.
But I can think about it to go to San Diego. But one of the points that she makes there is that people who experienced anti-Semitism, that trauma stayed with them. They never forgot it. They spoke about it years later when I studied Boston Jewry. Everybody remembered, we were beaten up in the 30s by the thugs of Father Coughlin. It stuck with them forever. And so it is with the young people who were traumatized on university campuses. this will stick with them their whole lives and mark them. Whereas my students in the late 90s, anti-Semitism was ancient history. They didn't know it. A book came out by a young Jew. He thought he was very clever. He was predicting the future. And he spoke about, the book's title is The Death of American Anti-Semitism. And he wrote about how we should shift resources. It wasn't very timely, that book. And but Seinfeld recently said, you know, he would never have done his TV series. He thought anti-Semitism was a relic of the past. So young people feel vulnerable because nothing that they learned prepared them for Pittsburgh, really, or for the return of anti-Semitism. And that's changing. But let's end on a good note. I actually think we have someone here from Pew will not back up. I expect that when they do the next Pew survey, intermarriage will be down, maybe for a bad reason. A lot of non-Jews don't want to date Jews. But Jews turning inward, I'm not afraid of Jews turning inward. I think that might be a good thing. Turn inward, more Jewish education. We're seeing, haven't talked about it enough here, for the first time in 2 generations, significant conversion to Judaism. There was an article about it in the New Yorker. If it's in the New Yorker, you know it's a thing. And Adam Mintz claims 100% growth in his conversion class. The mikveh in Boston told me 50%. Those are big numbers. Mostly people who were non-Jewish, married a Jew, now want to be with Jews. So I expect intermarriage will be down. Day school education will be up, in part because in Florida, you're guilty of child abuse if you don't send your kid to a day school. And that's going to have a big impact going forward. So we may be vulnerable, but vulnerability can make us stronger. That is the great paradox of Jewish life. Those who try and destroy us find out that Jews emerge stronger. Jews wouldn't still be around but for that. And I think, and here I disagree, that the Golden Age, we have to reinterpret the Golden Age. The Golden Age is when Jews study, when they come to conferences like this, when they marry other Jews, when they strengthen Jewish institutions. That's the Golden Age. Maybe it's just the beginning. Thank you.
All I can say, they tried to destroy us. We're still quarreling and discussing. Let's have cookies and coffee. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.